So, ahead of that quarter-final, there was that feeling that whoever would beat Brazil would win the World Cup. England had, as it panned out, such an opportunity to beat Brazil that day. And I remember it being a bit het up. He was emotional. He was really emotional. Ashley Cole, still to this day, gets very annoyed about that, believing that we didn't treat David Seaman with the respect he deserved. There's no getting away from it. He wasn't a favourite of the media at the time. England could easily have done that. I could easily have won that game and gone on to win the tournament.
Welcome to Make Football Great Again, the podcast that's not only your definitive 48-nation roadmap to the 2026 World Cup, but is also taking you behind the velvet rope of the world's greatest sports event. I'm Harry Brent, and today I'm joined by Andy Dunn, who's going to be bringing us the untold stories from the 2002 World Cup. Andy, thank you for being here, mate. Good to see you.
Pleasure.
How are you keeping?
Yeah, all good. Thank you, mate.
So the 2002 World Cup, the first of the new millennium, the first to be held in Asia, and the first to be held jointly by two different nations: Japan. There you go, got it in my finger in the right place, and South Korea. It's fair to say, Andy, that I'm characterising this as a World Cup of surprises. We had, two tournament favourites, arguably going into it: France and Argentina, bowing out in the group stage. We had deep runs from the likes of Senegal, Turkey, and a Guus Hiddink-led South Korea, who just could not stop beating the big boys. They knocked out Portugal, they knocked out Italy, and then they knocked out Spain, albeit with some very questionable refereeing decisions going their way. Make of that what you will. Ireland had let's not forget, had a World Cup to remember. It all began with the infamous Saipan incident. Roy Keane flying home sensationally, quitting the Ireland national team, going home to walk his dogs after falling out with Ireland manager Mick McCarthy. Robbie Keane scoring that iconic late equaliser, it wasn't that good, against Germany in the group stage before Ireland eventually were beaten on penalties in the last 16 by Spain. It was also a tournament for redemption arcs. Ronaldo, the Brazilian version, that is, overcoming those career-threatening knee injuries he suffered in the years prior to fire Brazil to glory as part of front three that was honestly one of the most fearsome front threes in the history of football, alongside Ronaldinho and Rivaldo, and going on to score both goals against Germany in the final. And of course, from an England standpoint, David Beckham banishing the ghost of his red card at France 98 by smashing home England's winning goal from the penalty spot against Argentina in the group stage. A penalty, incidentally, conceded by none other than former Tottenham and Chelsea manager Mauricio Pochettino. And it's worth saying, a massive dive by Michael Owen, as it turns out. But VAR was not around 22 years ago, or 24 years ago, flipping heck. It's been that long, so who cares? For England fans back home, it was a bit of a strange one. 7 a.m. kickoffs, breakfast pints, if you're so inclined, and TVs set up in offices and schools throughout the country. For journalists, Andy, it was similarly strange. Not least given where you started, kind of the reporting from. I'm told all the journalists were whisked off by England to a honeymoon island. Very, very romantic, very, very seductive, very Sven Goran Eriksson in lots of ways. Can you just talk us through that? What was the reason for that, and what was it like?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, bear in mind the squad did come as well. It wasn't just the FA whisking us off. Yeah, honestly, Harry. But the one thing about Sven, dearly missed Sven. Loved him to bits, Sven. He was great fun. And the one thing about him, one of the many things about him was that he did love a trip. He did love to take the squad to some nice places. And they actually went to Dubai first for a bit of rest and recreation. Sven and Nancy and the players and family. And they had a bit of rest and recreation in Dubai first. And then the squad, for their pre-World Cup training camp, which they often have, they went to Jeju, you're right, which is a beautiful honeymoon. It's now a honeymoon island. It was a fishing island off the coast of South Korea. A stunning place. And we were there for a good week, but it was like being, it really was being away from everywhere. And I remember going out into the hotel grounds and toured Griffiths, Sven's assistant. I remember one day he went running in the woods and we lost him. He got lost and we had to send out a search party for good old Todd. And we eventually located him. And it was just slightly surreal, as a lot of the Sven regime was. I remember there was a beautiful, beautiful golf course there called Nine Bridges, on which they play PGA Tour events. And it was just an idyllic place. Again, though, it's like at many World Cups, the journalists and the squad together. So it wasn't, we got on okay, but at the time it was dominated, Harry. The build-up was dominated in Jeju, toing and froing between us and the FA and Sven, and in particular his fitness coach, who was a guy called Ivan Carminati. It was over the fitness of David Beckham. So I don't know if you remember, but that was, David Beckham's foot injury was the talking point before. Would he be fit? I remember in Jeju, we were going from Jeju to play a friendly in Seoul on the mainland. And before that game, a couple of days before that game, Sven had said, as you imagine, it was Bex was front and centre of all of the coverage, and it was a question of whether he'd be fit or not. And we said to Sven, well, what would happen if Beckham was not fit for the first 2 games of your 3-game qualifying group? And he said, well, I'd have to make a decision. I would probably send him home and get a replacement. Bear in mind, there was already replacements coming and going with Trevor Sinclair going home, then coming back. Danny Murphy, of course, pulled out. Kieran Dyer pulled out. Anyway, we then had an interview with Ivan Carminati, who said Beckham wouldn't be fit for the first 2 games. So we put 2 and 2 together, came up with the Beckham's going home line. It went in the papers on the front pages of Bye Bye Becks, a picture of him on the airplane. And of course, the next morning, when we woke up, there he was, getting warmed up for the game the next day. So we were sort of misled then. So that got the whole thing off to quite an amusing start. But that dominated then. So we were in Jeju, and then again, England being England, when we then went to the mainland, Japan, this time to begin the tournament, where England were based on another island, an island called Awaji Island, not far from Kobe, where we were based. So yeah, it was slightly odd.
Yeah, strange start to the tournament. And speaking of starts to the tournament, England kicked off with a draw with Sweden. They were drawn in a group of death, as it was coined, with Sweden, Argentina, and Nigeria. Faced Sweden first, got a draw, which meant that they really had to get a result in their second game against Argentina, who, like we said at the top, was, were one of the favourites heading in, and get a result they did. Talk us through that day in Sapporo. What was the build-up like? What was the aftermath like? And where does this rank in terms of, great England results at a World Cup?
Well, first of all, you're right. The opening game, it was a relative group of death, I suppose you could say, in comparison to some of the groups England have had subsequently. Obviously, the 1-1. So the first game was in Saitama, and any doubts over Beckham's fitness had pretty much disappeared by then. Well, when I say disappeared, I'm not sure he was entirely fit for the whole tournament, but that's another subject. But anyway, I think he crossed for Sol Campbell to score against Sweden. Sweden equalised, and that was 1-1. And yeah, so the build-up, listen, the rivalry between England and Argentina at that point, exacerbated by what happened in 1998 and other things off the field, of course, was really, it was intense. It was intense. And as it happened, the English journalists, the media, us, we were staying in the same hotel as the Argentina team. And the game itself, let's say, in the Sapporo Dome, I think the roof was closed, I'm pretty sure. I can't quite remember. I think it was. Anyway, it wasn't a great game, let's be honest. It was a poor game. And you described there Michael Owen using his nous to go down in the penalty area. I think, a lot of people have remarked on that before. Gets the penalty. Beckham scores, hits down the middle, scores, and England hang on. And it was It was a funny night, really, because I remember the England fans, there wasn't a massive congregation of England fans, but they made themselves known. We got back to the hotel, the English media, we got back to the hotel. We had a couple of drinks, and the Argentina team come back and they have a meal. They're going to stay over and leave the next day. And we're all writing our follow-ups. And I remember the next day, we go to the coach outside to get our bus to the airport. And then one of our press men, a guy from the Press Association called John Curtis, a guy who sadly passed away quite recently, lovely man. Anyway, he was miles away, and he just gets on the bus, he sits down, and the bus revs up its engine, and it's about to pull off. And then next minute, he hears these people saying, "What are you doing here?" He looks round, and there's Veron, Batistuta, and he's completely gone the wrong bus. And he literally was just about to be taken away with them. And then he gets back on our bus. And the ramifications of that game, it gave England, even though the third game, Nigeria, England in Osaka, I think it was, again, was a little bit of a non-event. It gave England, I think, that lift for the knockout stage. It gave them that lift. It gave them that impetus. And, it was any win over Argentina at that point was quite significant. And it just did give everyone a lift heading back to Awaji Island.
What did that goal for Beckham do in terms of his kind of reputation at home? I mean, obviously coming out of France '98, he was the villain, getting sent off for the kick out of Diego Simeone, and he was, vilified back home. I know, obviously, in the qualifying campaign, that magnificent performance and free kick against Greece kind of solidified him once again as, England's golden boy. But did this kind of rubber stamp that, or or was Beckham's reputation mended by then? Did he need this for his kind of reputation and relationship with England fans?
Yeah, I think it was significant. It was certainly significant back home. Again, it was difficult when one of the things about doing a World Cup in somewhere like Japan and South Korea, although obviously England were exclusively based in Japan, was that, again, you didn't get a true feel for what the feeling was back home amongst fans, amongst England followers. But certainly out there, you thought he'd become... The thing is, when Sven took over in early 2001, he actually, I think, officially started. Obviously, Kevin Keegan left in October of 2000 after that game against Germany at Wembley. And Sven immediately made it quite plain that David Beckham was going to be his leader, his captain, his right-hand man, his best mate, his everything, really. It was all Sven and Beck's. So it was quite clear then that he was going to be, front. And Beckham had made a conscious effort as well to really, really sort of, I wouldn't say it wasn't a case of making amends, but it was a case of him wanting to make almost his era. It became his era. And that goal against Argentina, albeit, a standard penalty kick, was part of that, was him, which is why he was so clearly desperate to be fit for that tournament. Again, whether or not he was fully fit for that tournament, I'm not sure. And obviously that history repeated itself in the following tournament in 2006, not with Beckham, but with Wayne Rooney. I'm sure in another podcast we will discuss that one. And I'm not sure, but basically he was then, not just the captain, but he's front and centre of everything that the England setup was about then. So that was significant for him. I'm saying it did give and Beckham was also at the stage then, Harry, which people will be interested in what people think, but he was at the stage then where he was involved in everything about how the England team and the setup is run. And it's something that we've got nowadays with a captain as authoritative as Beckham was. Kane is similar now. I'm not sure Rooney was quite like this, but maybe a little bit. But what you've got then, I think it was the first of its kind, maybe, where that captain is close to the coach, to the head coach, and basically has a say in pretty much everything. And I'm on about, in Beckham's case, and I think people will hardly be surprised, but what the suit's going to be like, what you're going to wear casually, not just suits, okay, we'll wear waistcoats, we'll wear this, we'll wear that, we'll wear. He had a say in everything. The design of the match suits, design of the leisure wear, whatever they were going to wear, where they stayed, who stayed where, what hotel. I remember him who had what. We'd go to Spain on a. Don't think it was ahead of that. I think that might have been ahead of 2004 Euros. Who stayed in what villa, menus and stuff like that. It's something that people maybe don't realise, but that's what the type of thing that Beckham got involved in. And he would go back to the players to counsel them, ask them for what they put in, go back to Sven, go back to the FA, and say, well, we want to do this, we want to do that, we don't want this, we don't want that. Where do you want to stay? And hence, there was always this big debate about where England should stay at major tournaments. Do you want to be amongst in a city so you can mix, you can go out, you can have a coffee, but you're going to be seen, you're going to be, no, I wouldn't say hounded, you're going to be asked for autographs, or do you want to be isolated? And as it happened in Japan, they were out in a place called Awaji Island. We used to have to go over a bridge to see them there. We were all based in a very big, very famous Japanese city called Kobe. So yes, so in answer, originally, it just really, the goal against Argentina cemented his standing really as the central figure in this England setup.
England, in their final group game against Nigeria, only managed a 0-0 draw, which meant they finished second in the group below Sweden. Went on to a last 16 game against Denmark, fairly routine 3-0 win to book a quarter-final clash with the mighty Brazil. Looking back at that, going into that game, Andy, did it feel like, particularly given the big teams that had gone out at that stage, did it feel like the winner of that game was going to go and win the World Cup?
It did. I mean, it did feel a bit like that. I mean, well, from the sense that, you looked at the pathway and it was going to be Turkey in the semi-finals, and then a fairly sort of what would you call it? I mean, a fairly sort of standard, not standard, but like uninspiring German team, but is also still in the tournaments. Yes, and you do. But from England's point of view, you felt that no matter who was left, you felt that Brazil were clearly the best team. You mentioned before, a front three of Rivaldo, Ronaldinho, and Ronaldo, the three R's. You felt like that was, the best that was around. You felt that they were the favourites. Luis Philippe Scolari, they were absolutely, confident. You could tell they were confident. Scolari would, England would be training behind closed doors. I'm sure you've heard you'll hear on other World Cup. This is when we look back on other World Cups about the media trying to spy on England camps. In Scolari's case, he used to just invite you in. I mean, he'd invite you in and say, So I remember before the final in Yokohama, we went to the training session, and Scolari says, "Right, come in, guys. Come in, no problem." And then with England, what happens is after 10 minutes, you watch them for 10 minutes. England, you watch them essentially warm up. That's what you see them run up and down. They might do a few volleys and headers, but essentially you watch them warm up. You get 10, 15 minutes. You can take a few pictures nowadays, and then you're out. You're out after 15 minutes, and then the session is closed. Again, there's times when the media have tried to spy and got into trouble, but basically it's then a closed session. So before the World Cup final, we go and see Brazil. Obviously, England are out by now, and Scolari comes in. So after about 15 minutes, we're looking around, saying, "Right, okay, are we out now?" Not a chance. Scolari says, "No, you can stay for the whole thing." So you stayed for the entire thing. Now, by the way, the entire training session was just basically they had a match, which it was just brilliant. It wasn't any like drills or set pieces. It was skins against shirts. Let's play, and they had a laugh. But basically, Scolari's point of view was, listen, we know how good we are. We know whatever. So we've got nothing. No one, it doesn't matter what so-called secrets come out, no one can do anything about it. So, ahead of that quarter-final, there was that feeling that whoever would beat Brazil would win the World Cup. That's the feeling. Never mind who was left in it. Whoever was going to beat Brazil was going to win the World Cup. And England had, as it panned out, such an opportunity to beat Brazil that day. Several things about that day. that game against Nigeria was played in was it a soccer? I think it was a soccer, the Big Swan Stadium. Was that in soccer? I might be confused, but I think that's where it was. But I remember it being quite a relatively mild, might even been a wet day. But essentially, ahead of the tournament, we wondered if the conditions would be against England, hot, humid. And as it happened, for all the games prior to that Brazil game, they weren't. The conditions were not much different from English conditions. Plus, we'd played late in the day in Japan. We moved to Shizuoka for the quarter-final, and it was a 3:30 in the afternoon game. And for the first time, I remember waking up that morning, on the morning of the game, and looking out. It was a beautiful part of the world. It's just the stadium's in the sort of, you can see Mount Fuji dominates the skyline. And it was a beautiful, sunny, warm day. And I just thought it's just the last thing that England needed. However, the game then starts and pans out. Listen, and England weren't spectacularly good, but took the lead when Lucio, who I used to think was a fantastic defender, but was prone to this type of mistake, made the mistake. Michael Owen, still to me, one of the best finishers I've seen. Finishers, and this one was a good finish and clipped us ahead. And we're 1-0 up. And we're 1-0 up going into added time of the first half. And then everything, of course, then unravelled.
Yeah, Rivaldo scoring an equaliser. And then in the second half, Ronaldinho famously lobbing David Seaman from about 50 yards with that free kick, which ended up being the winner. Seaman at the time, that was his last England World Cup. He was 38 at that point. Ended up being one of his final England games. And he's spoken in the past about feeling, that he obviously felt he cost England at their place at that World Cup. What was it? What was it like afterwards? Did you see Seaman after the game? Was he emotional? Were there tears? Yeah. What was going on?
It was quite a. How can I put it? Yes, it was an emotional scene. It was a fractious scene. Just going back, of course. It was his fault, no doubt about it. And you're right. Rivaldo scored in the second minute of injury time in the first half. Obviously, if you remember rightly, David Beckham didn't do himself any justice in a tackle by the halfway line. Paul Scholes, similarly. Scholes and Beckham basically might have made tackles to stop that move causing any problems. But in the end, Ronaldinho passed to Rivaldo. Rivaldo scores. Ronaldinho then that bizarre 40-yard free kick that wasn't a shot that goes in. But then, of course, just not long after it, probably less than 10 minutes after that, with a good half hour to go, Ronaldinho gets sent off.
People forget about this.
They do. Ronaldinho got sent off, and again, I think I'm pretty sure he got sent off. He left his foot in on Danny Mills, if I remember rightly, which is normally the other way around, as you all know. That was a first, and he gets sent off rather harshly. He got sent off, and but England, of course, completely failed to take any advantage of that, and actually, to be honest, didn't really look as though they were going to take advantage of it. Anyway, yes, but after the game, so we have the mix zone where obviously the players come through. Sven comes in, and Sven was like, typical Sven. I'll tell her something about that a bit later about Sven. But so the players come in. Now, the background to the David Seaman situation, and this is a bit, this is how the media works. Basically, over the course of a tournament, and it's a long time, and in Japan and South Korea, because you had quite a big pre-tournament base camp in the beautiful island of Jeju, and a couple of games at home before you left, it was a long stint. I was away. I remember I was away for 7 weeks in all. I stayed after England were knocked out and stayed for the semi-finals and the final in Yokohama. So, we were away for 7 weeks. And we were away for that long with the team and the squad. Certain players are very communicative and, we'll have a chat and we'll do their media duties or media commitments. They're not obligations. They don't have to do them. But, you tend to develop, the media tend to develop, relationships with certain players that are better than with others. And I think that's fair. That's only natural. The same within a squad. If you're away with 26 other people, chances are if you're away for 5-6 weeks, there are going to be some people you don't go on well with as others. Anyway, the bottom line is that for that particular tournament, David Seaman had basically not been. He had not done many media commitments. He had not spoken to the media. He had made it clear, I think, that he didn't want to do that. I wouldn't say he made it clear his sort of his antipathy towards the media, but he hadn't been, let's put it this way, overly friendly. He didn't have to be, and he basically hadn't spoken like David had. And anyway, so then when he also would say is that when he then comes into the mix zone after the game, and after every game in the mix zone, he hadn't spoken. So he comes into the zone where the players come through, and after every game, and bear in mind he's had a good tournament. He's had a decent tournament. He's kept clean sheets, and he's had a decent tournament. So, but he wasn't speaking, and he wouldn't speak in those mix zones. But for the first time he wanted to speak was after, obviously, he makes the error in the in the quarterfinal. Fine. And then what happened was that, listen, to this day, I'm not sure that this is correct, but apparently, and Ashley Cole has actually spoken about this on a podcast. Ashley has actually said that he was annoyed. I remember Ashley getting annoyed in that mix zone, saying that we weren't treating David with the respect he deserved. I'm not sure that was correct. I think someone, maybe ill-advisedly and mockingly, sort of aimed a sort of a jeer at him. I don't think it was any of the mainstream English media, but I don't know. And I remember it being a bit het up. He was emotional. He was really emotional, and understandably so. But the genesis of how that little sort of scene occurred in the mix zone, as I say, Ashley Cole still to this day gets very annoyed about that, believing that we didn't treat David Seaman with the respect he deserved, is because, I would say at that time, he wasn't there's no getting away from it, he wasn't a favourite of the media at the time because he hadn't been particularly communicative during the tournament. And as I say, it's also the culmination of, 5 weeks away, I would have thought. First on Ireland, then on another sort of bolt hole.
In that podcast, you referenced, Cole was saying, or claiming at least, that Seaman was being laughed at. And from what you're saying there, that wasn't necessarily the case, or perhaps, do you think?
No, that wasn't the case. From what I recall, that certainly wasn't the case. But do I think that, listen, was it different, say, to when Harry came into the mix zone after missing that late penalty against France at Qatar 2022? Did he receive overwhelming sympathy from the English media in the interview area after that game? Absolutely. Did David Seaman receive unconditional sympathy from the English media when he came into the interview area after that game in Shizuoka at World Cup 2002? Well, no, he didn't. He didn't, it has to be said. So you probably, guess from that. But there was, but as far as I'd said, I think no one was laughing. No one was laughing at David Seaman, as far as I recall.
Yeah, interesting contrast with the different sort of cultures and vibes with the relationship the press has with England. Those two different tournaments. I'm just going to fire some quick fire questions at you just to get a little bit more of a feel for what it was like to be out there in Japan and South Korea. What was the best thing about that tournament for you?
Oh, the best thing was the efficiency of the place, the politeness of the people. The fascination of the new culture, because it is a different culture. The cities were great. You think of it of Japan as just being, Tokyo, and South Korea as just being Seoul. Instead, like the absolute, a great variety of places. We stayed in a city called Kobe, which is, people may know, particularly for the tragic earthquakes that strike it. It's very prone to, and really tragic earthquakes. Fascinating place, absolutely incredible. The people unfailingly polite. And of course, it is a little bit of a cliche, but the punctuality of public transports, the punctuality of the trains, again, it's a bit of a cliche that, if you book yourself on a bullet train, which we did to get down to Shizuoka for that ill-fated game, if you're not, it arrives on time, and if you're not on in 40 seconds, it's gone. And you're not on it. And the efficiency of that World Cup was fantastic. The stadium, Harry, were great. They were really great. As I say, the Big Swan name, because it looks like the Big Swan, was fantastic. Again, so many World Cup hosts now, have done. I mean, it's not going to happen in the States because they're all there, but have purpose-built stadiums for the events. And that was the same in Japan. And it was just great, as always, to learn about a completely different culture. A culture that is not is quite hard for us to understand. And quickly, one other thing was as well that it was at the time that 2002 was at a very interesting point in terms of technology. So I'll tell you a thing. We went to so I'll tell you what time we went out, a few of the journalists, to a bar in Kobe called the Penguin Bar. It was called the Penguin Bar, because it had penguins in it, and you went in, and there was a case, water, feature, whatever. You get a drink, and then in it was penguins with numbers on the back, 1 to 11. The penguins in there, and there was a pond there like that. So there's a pond, and what you do is the penguins. If you ever noticed penguins, they feign as if they're going to go into the water and then don't. So they all sort of like they're about. You think, oh, he's going. Anyway, basically, you bet on which one's going to actually get in the water first. So 1 to 11, and you have a bet and whatever. I mean, bizarre. But I remember that night, and Kobe was not. Had it not been for, was not a place where many Westerners were based or visited. And it wasn't a World Cup city in that there was no games played there. We were just there because England were across the bridge in a place called Awaji Island. And so we're in the bar, and then after a while, the locals start coming in, who we're obviously told that like there's some sort of strangers in town. They come in and they start pointing the phones at us. Their mobile phones. And literally, we didn't know what they were doing. So we said to our guide who was there, what are they doing? Why are these guys pointing their phones? They said they're taking pictures of you. But they're doing what? Pictures. And that was the time, would you believe? I mean, the kids can't believe this happened. That was the time. They said, oh, these are the latest mobile phones. These phones have got cameras in them. And it was like, phones? Cameras in them? Cameras in phones? And what happened then? Because I remember a well-known technological company actually spent a day at the England camp on Awaji Island in their hotel, basically selling showing their wares, the latest, as you can imagine, the technology of these companies. And that was, so it was, that World Cup was like an eye-opener in what you're going to see next, in what we've all got in our pockets now, in our, as I say, it just seems like, and wow, I remember when during that World Cup, the first phone I saw with the camera.
Did you have any chance encounters with anyone super famous while you were out there? Did you bump into anyone that you were particularly starstruck?
Yeah, I did actually. I've had a few World Cups, and I have had a few, and this one in 2002. So England get knocked out. And I go then to, we decamp to Tokyo, which is an unbelievable city. I mean, it's a great city, Tokyo. But anyway, this was such a chance encounter. I was staying at a hotel in Yokohama, which was actually obviously outside Tokyo, and it's where the final was. And then I got out, on the first night, I left my room, went to the lift to get down, and it was so it's like, I just thought she looks famous. And it was Anastasia. You might know
Of all
Anastasia, who
people.
sang then, and I wondered what she was doing there, said hello, and it turns out she did. And then the next time I saw her after that chance encounter in the hotel was at the final where she sang before the final.
Okay, she was there on business. Okay,
She was there
right.
on business. She wasn't just there
take her for a
taking the
football
game or
fan,
just
yeah.
happened to be shopping in Tokyo or just thought, well, I'll hang around here and meet the... Yeah, no, she was there. So it was Anastasia in 2002. You know, and I always thought she'd be the most sort of famous woman I'd sort of bump into. But then I did bump into Pamela Anderson in Russia in 2018.
Wow.
She was going with a French player at the time, Adel Rami.
It wouldn't have taken. Well, again, that explains it. But I would not have taken either of them to be big football fans necessarily. Was this England's best chance to win a World Cup since '66?
I think going into the tournament, I would said no, it's not their best chance to win since '66. Well, actually, at the time, maybe at the time, I thought it was a good squad. Obviously, we're missing a couple of players, but I thought it was a really good squad. I didn't probably think. Listen, after 40 minutes, 45 minutes of the quarterfinal, yes, it was the best chance. I really do think it was the best chance. Brazil were really not at it that day. It was a good Brazil team, but they were really not at it that day in Shizuoka. England could easily have done that. I could easily have won that game and gone on to win the tournament. So yes, I do. And even now, I think it opened up for them, or it would have opened up for them, and it would have been a better chance then than it was 20 years later when England lost to France in 2022.
Mm. Yeah, because obviously it would have been Turkey in the semis. And,
Turkey and Germany,
not a bad side in that tournament, but
although Brazil only got past them 1-0, didn't they? I think.
Exactly, yeah.
I think so.
And then Germany, of course, England had beaten them 5-1 a few months earlier in the final, so that what could have been there. Who did England miss more at that tournament? Gary Neville or Steven Gerrard? Both missed out through injury. Who do you think they missed more?
They did. I'm not sure they missed either of them that much in terms of Steven Gerrard, who was fantastic for England, but we had a good midfield then. We had the Scholes, mainly Manchester United's midfield to a large extent. I don't think so. Maybe in a strange way, maybe we missed Gary Neville. Maybe we missed Gary Neville. Maybe had Gary Neville been in that team, maybe Scholes and Beckham may have stopped that move that led to Rivaldo's equaliser just before the half-time whistle. Maybe Gary Neville at halftime might have roused the team. Maybe he would have been more. Again, I'm not sure. You're always going to miss Steven Gerrard, and for what he did. I mean, you mentioned that game against Germany in Munich in September 2001, and you miss his inspiration. But maybe over the whole thing, maybe Neville.
Hmm. And Sven, throughout his reign, really seemed to have this kind of Zen approach. Sven's Zen. There's a tongue twister for you.
Zen, you're an Ericsson.
Do you think this approach ultimately helped or hindered the players? Did it relax them too much, or was the relaxing nature of him just what they needed?
I go back. I absolutely, I really, really enjoyed covering England under Sven-Göran Eriksson. I enjoyed his company, both professionally and on the times that we socialised with Sven. He never took things too seriously. And, the players liked playing for him probably because of that, probably because he did allow them to... I think he pretty much allowed them to run the show. To be brutally honest, I think he probably allowed them to basically, I wouldn't say do what they want, do it within reason. I mean, he's by no means a disciplinarian, Sven, so in a way, so that allows the players to relax, because after all, they're away on international duty. Now, I know it's the World Cup, but they're away from their clubs. You can't have, I don't think you can have the sort of, full-on, sort of disciplinary sort of framework that you have at clubs when you go on international duty. There is, in the end, they don't have to go. They do not have to be there. I'm not saying that, there's very, 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 very few players who wouldn't want to be there. We can all probably name a handful throughout time who've decided that they don't want to play international football. But so I think the idea that Sven had that, you win, this isn't a club. You're not coming in and saying, right, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to be so. So I guess that got them. However, and on that particular day, for example, when they got knocked out, did England miss more of a motivating figure? Well, a lot of people thought they did. And if, people might remember what Gareth Southgate said after that game, not immediately after that game. Gareth Southgate was obviously in the England World Cup squad of 2002. He was on the bench for that game against Brazil, the quarterfinals, didn't get onto the pitch. And later he made what became quite an infamous comment on what happened there, when he said, obviously Rivaldo, England are quite comfortable at 1-0 ahead after Owen's goal. Rivaldo then scores the equaliser, 45+2, I think. And that's like, a hammer blow at the end of the half. And Southgate came out with the quote, later on, I'm not sure how later on after the tournament it was, but basically he said, in the dressing room, we needed Winston Churchill and we got Ian Duncan Smith. And that sort of, I think, in a nutshell, maybe sums up how Sven was. He was quite easygoing. He could get annoyed. But overall, I would say probably the Zen-like approach in the end for England probably was, I wouldn't say key, but instrumental in probably England not quite getting past certain stages in tournaments under Sven.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for all of that. Great stuff. Well, that just about does it for our journey back to the 2002 World Cup. Tune in again next time for more untold stories from the FIFA World Cup, as well as for the launch of our gigantic preview for the 2026 World Cup, where we'll be sitting down with a representative from every single nation heading to the tournament this summer. And of course, our World Cup coverage does not stop there. Follow Mirror Football on social media for all the latest news and analysis, and head over to mirror.co.uk/football for the same thing. And give us a follow. Make football great again. We're on YouTube, we're on Apple, we're on Spotify. And leave a comment wherever you can to join the conversation with me, Harry Brent, as well as with Andy Dunn, Jeremy Cross and John Cross. Until next time, keep making football great again.